QSO Today, episode 429, Michael Crestohl W1RC. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest amateur radios and accessories for your ham radio station, and by Nuts and Volts magazine. Save the date. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo will return on March 25th and 26th, 2023. We are making changes and upgrades that reflect our user feedback. If you did not fill out our Expo survey that we sent recently, please check on the banner in this week's show notes page or on the weekly podcast notification. We do want to hear from you, even if you did not attend the last Expo. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Just a note to let you know that the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is back on YouTube. There are now over 300 presentations to upload, and I hope to add one or two a day to the channel. I will put a link in the QSO Today website and the Expo website. Mike Crestohl W1RC is a benevolent dictator and founder of the Near Fest New England Amateur Radio Festival, a collector of World War II spy radios, a journalist with contributions to amateur magazines, and a lover of Collins boat anchor gear. Mike likes to operate a remote station while on the road and is my QSO Today. W1RC, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Mike?
Yes, I am. Good morning.
Good morning, Mike. Thanks for joining me at the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I first became interested in radio when I was very young. My parents sent me off to boarding school, which I loathed, absolutely loathed. And my roommate had a radio that had shortwave bands on it. Now, this was in the fall of 1957-58. And I remember out of boredom and not liking anybody there because they were all a lot older than I was, I started playing with his radio and tuning around, and I started listening to shortwave broadcasts. I listened to Radio Moscow, all of the Eastern European countries, and they were really heavily into USA bashing at that time. I found that very entertaining. And I actually listened to Radio Moscow in October when they launched Sputnik. I heard Sputnik on the radio. That just blew me away, like, wow, this is great. So that was the interest in this box that would allow me to hear things all around the world and even from outer space in 1957.
Where was the boarding school and what part of the world?
It was in Connecticut. I should tell you that I was born and raised in Montreal, Canada. And what was I doing at a boarding school in the United States? Well, that's where my parents decided they were going to send me. And being a foreigner didn't help. I wasn't very popular at that, so I can tell you. I was young, very young. I think I was the youngest person in the school. I only went there for 1 year, thankfully. I told them I absolutely refused to go back. And I ran away a couple times, too. Now, bear in mind, I was 11 years old. And I actually got to New York City and got to Port Authority bus terminal and was caught trying to buy a ticket to Montreal. Anyways, that was the end of my stay at that school, and but the radio experience never left me, and I remembered it. In Montreal, there were a number of surplus stores where you could go and buy military surplus stuff from the war, and they had electronics, including radio receivers, and I saved my pennies and delivered newspapers, and I bought a receiver capable of receiving the shortwave bands and set it up at the house with an antenna, and I spent a great deal of time listening to that radio. I remember the radio was a Canadian Marconi CSR-5A. It was actually used by the Royal Canadian Navy. And just progressed from there and decided that I wanted to learn more about it, and I wanted to learn code, and I learned code.
Well, how did you learn code? From listening on the radio?
By listening on the radio, and then I joined the Montreal Amateur Radio Club. There was a gentleman there named Don Dashney. His call was V2SH, V3RM. He was from Ottawa, and he worked for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And Don Dashney ran the code and theory classes, which were a 6-month course of study, one night a week, where you learned the code, and you learned the theory and the rules, and you were prepared to write the Canadian Amateur Radio Certificate of Proficiency exam, which was the first license, which I did.
Now, were there age requirements? I mean, some of these Commonwealth countries had age requirements for amateur radio licenses. Did you have that problem in Montreal?
As did Canada, yes. The age was 15, but that was dropped later. Now there is no age limit. If you can pass the test, as in the United States, you can be licensed.
So you were 12, 13 years old then when you were taking this course, or did you wait until you were 15?
I enrolled in the course when I was 14 in the fall and became 15 in March and then wrote the test, got my certificate. So, it was an interesting experience. I didn't actually have a station at home for 5 years. I didn't have any opportunity to have an antenna, and I was busy with my studies, but I got on in 66. That was basically the first year that I got on the air when I was 20.
Were your parents supportive of this newfound interest?
Not really. They told me that, I should concentrate more, on studies and career and this type of thing, and they were worried I would electrocute myself, my mother particularly. So it wasn't something I was really encouraged to do, but not really discouraged either. But I had other interests too, and oh, absolutely.
So what were some of those other interests?
Well, right around that time I became interested in young ladies and became interested in cars and things of that nature, became interested in aviation. There were a lot of things to do, and radio was just about one of them. It wasn't a fixation with me. It wasn't, an obsession. It was just one of my interests. And I find now, and throughout my life, I've been able to have interests in many different and various areas, shall we say.
And was the first driver's license, was that 16 years of age like it was in America during that period of time?
17 in the province of Quebec. And you had to drive around the block in their beat-up old car. And if you could pass the test in their car, you got a chauffeur's license, which was a higher-level license. And if you had to take it in an automatic transmission, you got the operator's license, a conducteur, and the chauffeur. I had the chauffeur's license just because I wanted to get the higher-class license.
And since we're talking about cars, what was your first car?
I got a 1952 MGTD that I bought and I drove for a while, and I sold it, and I bought another one. And I started buying and selling cars to have transportation, which I did for many, many years until the Department of Motor Vehicles notified me that I could not do that anymore. I would have to get a dealer's license, or I could only restrict myself to 5 cars a year.
So you were turning over more than 5 cars a year?
Oh, yeah, I would do 10. In fact, when I was going to school, I worked isn't the word. I used to go to the dealer auction for a car dealer that I had met, and I used to buy cars for him at the auction, and in return for doing that, he'd pay me, but I got what was called in Quebec an X plate. It was a license plate with the first letter was X, and what that was a dealer plate, and you could put that on any vehicle and drive it legally, and I had an X plate that I could drive any car that he had on his lot. So I had a free car, and I was getting paid to go once a week to the dealer auction to buy cars for him.
What was the most exotic car that you had in your turning the cars over?
I didn't have anything really exotic. I had a Morgan 4.4 that I really liked. I had to sell it, though. It was worth too much money, and the insurance was too expensive. But I used to have whatever I wanted off of his lot, and he had an E-Type, a Jaguar E-Type, which I drove, but I hated it because it always was breaking down. It always had to go in the shop, and I never touched a Jaguar since.
Yeah, I've heard that about British cars.
Yes, the electrical systems were notorious. They used to call Joseph Lucas and company, who made the electrics, Prince of Darkness.
That's pretty funny. And you also had an interest in aviation. Did you become a pilot?
No, I was a member of the Royal Canadian Air Cadets, though, and that was fun. We used to go every Tuesday night and play Air Force and have a little fun, and we go to the Air Force bases and fly. And but no, I never actually went through and got my pilot's license. It was a very expensive proposition, and I could not get into the commercial area because I had to wear glasses, and at those times your vision had to be 20/20 uncorrected, or else you couldn't fly commercially, so it wasn't an option.
What direction did your studies go in college?
Journalism. I have degrees in journalism. I've worked as a daily reporter. I still write. Well, you read it if you're searching the web for what I'm up to. You read my stuff, and I sell stuff. In fact, I just did an article for QST. I did a review, a product review.
But you made your living as a journalist, and what did you write about?
Mostly human interest stuff. I worked in daily for a while. I worked in radio. I worked in the news department, a radio station, and I taught. I'd done all kinds of stuff like that.
And how did ham radio fit into this process along the way?
Well, I used the school station. I used the university stations and stuff, but it didn't really fit in that much. I didn't follow a technical career. I didn't become an ET or a double E or anything like that. My knowledge of radio and electronics is pretty limited to vacuum tube technology. Although I fool around with some of the newer stuff, but I don't really understand digital electronics, and I haven't really had an interest in learning it. I like vacuum tubes. I like vacuum tube equipment. My go-to station here is a KWM2A and a 30L1 amplifier. I know how it works. I can fix it, and every once in a while I do. I have boat anchors. I like boat anchors. I got Johnson Viking Ranger that has been 3 times detimtronized, and I can explain to you what that term means.
Yeah, and you might spell it for me, too.
Well, there is he would be an excellent person for you to interview, is Tim Smith, WA1HLR. Have you ever heard of him?
No, but now that I have, I'm going to check him out.
You're in for a treat. He's a very, very interesting individual. Tim and I have been friends for the same amount of time as I've known Tom Pereira, pretty much. Tim loves AM. He's probably one of the most knowledgeable people on AM amateur radio equipment there is. And his goal is to make it sound like a broadcast station, to make it sound as good as he can. And he's worked on my Johnson Viking Ranger 3 times, the 3rd level. His nickname that he's named himself is Timtron, and the process is called Timtronization. The radio's been Timtronized 3 times, 3rd level Timtron radio. It sounds like a broadcast station. I will give you his contact information.
Yeah, that would be great. Do you use it for regular nets?
I don't do nets, no.
Where do you use it?
On 3885 or 7290 on the known AM channels that are out there where people that like AM and good audio tend to hang out.
So you'll just CQ and see who's there, or do you kind of use it like you would a 2-meter simplex channel? I mean, you don't have to call CQ, just say you're there and people show up?
You turn it on, you hear a couple of guys talking and join in. Or you just get on, you can call CQ. There's a couple of regular get-togethers. There's you could call them nets, but they're just sort of events that happen on there. There's a couple of actual AM events. There's an AM rally, and there are a couple of, I hate to use the word contest, but they're not really contests. They're not competitive, but they're activity nights. People get on. You turn the radio on in the morning, and you hear regulars on there. You jump in and out.
Do you use the Collins KWM2 as the receiver with that Johnson Viking Ranger, or do you have something else that you like to use?
Oh, no. KWM2 has got much too narrow a bandpass. It's not switchable. It doesn't have an AM feature in it. I have an R390A that I can open up as wide as 16 kilohertz, so I can really enjoy the hi-fi component of some of these signals. Most of the time I open it up to about 8, but the KWM2 and most sideband radios are 2.1. It's far too narrow a bandpass to enjoy the quality audio that those signals have to offer. So no, I never used the KWM1. Also, you can't really turn the BFO off in the KWM2 because it wasn't made to do that.
Well, I actually knew that, but I figured that was the way to extract the Collins R390A out from you. I'm really glad.
All 4 of them, right?
You have 4 Collins R390As?
I got 4 R390As, 2 R390s, and I have an R725.
Wow.
A very, very rare variant of the R390A. It's an R390A with an R390IF deck, and it doesn't have the mechanical filter.
What was the model number for that?
R725, R725. They're considered to be a spook radio, too, because they were used by certain agencies. They claimed at the time that it was done for direction finding, but it wasn't. It was done for copying radio teletype traffic, because the filters tended to provide some type of a ringing effect, and they didn't want the... it essentially has the RF deck from an R390, and it's an R390A.
Now, do you rebuild those R390s, or do you buy them rebuilt?
Well, I've never paid to have one rebuilt, if that's what you're asking.
Do you do the work yourself? You have your own workbench for pulling them apart?
Oh, sure. They're not that hard to work on, really. I mean, as I told you previously, I'm not a technician. I don't have technician training. Everything I learned, I basically learned myself by doing. And there's a lot of material. There's a mailing list called R390A that actually I started with Chuck Ripple back in the late 90s, which is still going strong. It's on QTH.net. It's called R390A. And Floyd Sue, W1RC, out in Michigan, who used to make very interesting Collins instructional videotapes, like on how to, go through a KWM2 and line it up, or S-line. He made one with Chuck Ripple. What was Chuck's call? WA4. God, I forget his call. I haven't talked to Chuck for years. He used to do really high-end restorations on R390As. He was one of the top guys. And he did a video with Floyd, I think 4-5 hour video. And then they did an addendum video on the R390A. And they also did one on the Hammerland SP600. And one of my closest friends here in New England is George, K1ANX, who must have had 300-400 R390As pass through his basement over the years. In fact, getting into the subject of Nearfest, George does a forum at Nearfest. It's loosely called the R390A Forum. It's not always about the R390A, but it's about military radios and focuses a lot on the R390A. And that forum is packed to the doors. It's the most popular forum that we present, maybe second only or the same as whenever Tom, W1TP, does a forum. The room is packed.
Yeah, I can imagine. Let me just ask you just for a second. Give us a brief paragraph on what the Collins R390 receiver was in terms of when it was made, and I see it in my mind's eye. What I think about it when I think about it all is that the thing is really heavy. It
is. Weighs about 80 pounds, but it doesn't have to. You can take the modules out and then you can move them. It's early 50s, but now there's the R390 and there's the R390A. They are very different. The R390 was made by 2 contractors, Collins and Motorola, and they didn't have mechanical filters in them. About 1953, 54, the R390A was designed, and I've read that it was designed as a cost-cutting measure. Maybe it was, but it incorporated mechanical filters. It had 4 mechanical filters in it, and they made those up until 1986.
Really?
Vacuum tube radio, they made them up until last contract was in 1986. There's a lot of stories. There's a lot of lore. I mean, I could do an hour interview on R390, 390As with you, and I'd still have much material left over. So I don't want to get too deeply into it.
That's actually very amazing that they made that radio for that many years. And who was the customer for that radio in the 1980s?
Uncle Sam. Government agencies, military. They all branches of the military had those radios. They covered from up to 32 megahertz. They were not made for single sideband. They were made for AM, CW, and radio teletype. This was before sideband was really being used by the military. Sideband came in the military in the late 50s. And these were there used to be a transmitter-receiver combination. It was essentially the R388 and the BC610 series of military transmitters. In the early 50s, they designed a new transmitter called the T368, and the R390/390A became different stations in different configurations, and they had, a station name too. I'm not going to get into that; it gets confusing. But during the Cold War radios, essentially in the 50s in Europe, were the R390, 390A, and the T368. The T368 is a beautiful piece of military equipment. Have one right here. I'm looking at it.
And do you use it? Do you fire it up?
Oh, yeah. It's got a single 400A in the final, and it's got vacuum variable capacitors for the tank circuit. It's beautifully built. They cost a lot of money. But in the 50s, nobody cared how much this stuff cost, because we were fighting the commies, and we had to fight them. We had to give everything we had to fight them. And in Europe, of course, was the battlefield, in the 50s particularly, and this stuff was all over the place. And these radios weigh about 600 pounds. They're not exactly light.
They're rack-mounted, right, normally?
No, they're not. The T368 is mounted in its own cabinet on 3 drawers. The top drawer is the RF drawer, the middle drawer is the audio drawer, and the bottom drawer is the power supply. And they pull in and out.
Oh, interesting.
And you can pull them out and transport it.
And now this message from ICOM America. Happy holidays from ICOM. Spice up your ham shack this season with one of ICOM's popular handhelds, mobiles, or base stations. These radios are perfect for working your favorite bands while staying inside or venturing out this winter. It's the most wonderful time of the year to give a gift of ICOM. The ICOM IC705 is the perfect sidekick and QRP companion with base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. It has become the go-to baseband rig for microwave operators. Its features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen display with a live band scope and waterfall, 5 watts with a BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts with a 13.8 DC power supply, single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions, a micro USB connector, Bluetooth, and wireless LAN, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, a micro SD card slot, the HM243 microphone speaker is included, and it supports QRP and QRPP operations. The perfect accessory for the ICOM 705 is the optional LC192 backpack. The LC192 includes a special compartment for your IC705 and additional room for accessories. The ICOM ID52A is a VHF-UHF dual-band handheld portable transceiver with D-Star and FM dual-mode functions and is the first handheld amateur radio with a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display. This portable supports conventional FM communications and D-Star simplex, repeater, regional, worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet Gateway. You can even send photos over D-Star using your connected Android device. Other ID52 features include a wideband receiver with guaranteed range of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz, VV, UU, VU with dual DV mode, integrated GPS GLONASS receiver including grid square location, micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging, and of course, it is in an IPX7 waterproof case. The ID52A is the perfect companion to the IC705 as both use batteries, headsets, and the same Android app for D-Star operation. Create your own band opening with the ICOM IC9700. This transceiver brings direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world and is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy, including faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. More features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD with real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual-watch operation, and full duplex operation in satellite mode. The ICOM IC7300 is a high-performance HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed everyone's expectations. This transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. The IC7300 changed the way entry-level HF is designed. The ICOM IC7300 features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. This radio by far is the best HF rig that I have ever owned. I love it for its features and value. Now, I realize that this is a big list to give to Santa. You can easily argue that all of these fine ICOM rigs complement each other, and that you can't just have one without the others. Maybe Santa can even spread out the delivery of these great ICOM rigs before the next holiday season. In any case, be sure to tell your ICOM dealer that you heard about these amazing ICOM radios on the QSO Today podcast. And now, back to our guest. I want to talk about Nearfest, more about Nearfest itself, but when you mentioned that George gives a R390 talk at Nearfest and it draws a huge crowd, do you think that there's more users or more R390 aficionados on the East Coast in your area than there would be, say, on the West Coast? Do you think there's a regional interest in this radio, and that's why he gets the crowd?
No. There are users everywhere in the country, mostly in the United States because that's where they are, but overseas as well. Canada, people up there have them. Just if you go on the R390 email group, see where they are. They're all over the country. One of the most knowledgeable people on R390As is in Mississippi. Chuck Ripple was in Virginia. And there was a fellow out in Ohio who, I don't know if he's still around. I don't read the list anymore. I mean, how much can you write about a 70-year-old transmitter,
For some reason, I think it's possible that people do it. No, I've played with the 390 before, and it just has just a nice, warm sound. That's the only way I can describe it, when you compare it to some of the newer radios that seem a little bit, harsher maybe, but the 390 just has a very nice, warm sound, and there may be one reason.
Has a lot warmer sound when you modify the audio deck, too. In fact, the speaker, the rack-mounted speaker, the 19-inch speaker, twin speaker, those things go for $500 and up when they show up on eBay. They even made I won't say a copy, but one of the fellows out in Ohio was actually producing replicas because you couldn't get the speaker. I don't know why. I have one. I've had it for years, but they were also made by different contractors. Nice, but $500 for basically a panel with two speakers in it. It's a lot of money. I've seen R390As go for a lot of money, too. eBay, one of the fellows here, Ted, K1QAR, I don't know if he's doing it anymore, but he used to rebuild them completely. He also is a regular at Nearfest. He has his workshop. He brings a workshop up there and sets up, and he'll tune up your radio if you bring it up to him and for free. And he created the Desert Storm R390A, which is, I laugh about it because they did actually use R390As in the Gulf War. It's an interesting story. When we got involved over there, they brought all these Harrises and all these new stuff over there and set them up, and they immediately started overheating because they were force air cooled, and the sand in the air clogged the air filters, and they overheated. What the heck are we going to do? Well, they had a whole bunch of R390As stored away in an old mushroom mine in Pennsylvania, and they got them and took them over to the desert, and they worked fine. So he decided he was going to make an R390A to commemorate the Desert Storm. So he painted the front panel sand tan and went through them completely. He sold them on eBay. He gets like $1,800 for them. Good old Ted, you know.
Nice cottage industry. Who would have thought?
Oh, yeah. Ted's a piece of work, too. Anyways, they're very popular in a lot of places. Shortwave listeners used to treasure them back even in the 70s, and they were actually never classified. There was a place that was selling them brand new. One of the contractors that was making them was EAC, Electronic Assistance Corporation, better known as Hammerland, and they were selling them. They were advertised in QST for, I think, $1,700. New. You buy one brand new. So they were never classified. The manuals for them have no security classification on them. The most prized manual for those, by the way, is the Navy, the nav ships manual. It's totally different than the one that's used by the other branches of the service. It's an incredible document. They're very hard to get, but you have that manual and you know everything you need to know to totally overhaul and repair that radio.
Let's talk about Nearfest. What is Nearfest? I see that you're key to Nearfest, but could you say what is Nearfest and how it started and what your role is?
Nearfest is the New England Amateur Radio Festival, Nearfest. It's been held since May of 2007, and the last one was a couple of weeks ago, the 14th and 15th of October. That was Nearfest 32. It wasn't really 32, it was 29 because we missed 3 of them during COVID, but the numbering sequence continues. Nearfest is held at the Deerfield, New Hampshire Fairgrounds. It's the only place it's ever been held, approximately 15 miles east of Manchester, New Hampshire. And it's a beautiful country fairgrounds where this old New England family fair is being held since 1875, I believe. It's a nice grounds, beautiful place. We're going to go back a few years to 1973 when there was a net on 75 meters, like a swap net called the Hoss Traders, and they decided that they were going to have a get-together, so they had a get-together in the spring of 73 at a campground in Seabrook, New Hampshire. They had another one in 74, and they had another one in 75. They decided they were outgrowing the campground, so they decided to have it at the Deerfield Fairgrounds, so they went to Deerfield Fairgrounds in the spring of 76. I went to that one. And every year they would have the Hoss Traders at Deerfield, and then in the early 80s they decided to go and do it twice a year in the spring and fall. They did that up until 91. Fall of 92, was the last one at Deerfield, and then they moved it. They moved it to Rochester, New Hampshire Fairgrounds. They stayed there till the spring of 2001, twice a year, and then they moved it up to Hopkinton, New Hampshire Fairgrounds, always at a fairgrounds. In February of 2007, the Hoss Traders were 3 gentlemen, Norm, WA1IVB, today he's W1ITT, Joe, K1RQG, unfortunately a silent key, and Bob, W1GWU. Those were the 3 Hoss Traders. They announced in February of 2007 that they were done. They had done 33 years of doing the Hoss Traders event. All the proceeds that they collected after their expenses went to the Shriners Hospitals and Burns Unit in Boston, Springfield, Mass., and Montreal. They were done. They did not name a successor. They just said, we're done. And I heard this, and of course, being the flea market junkie that I am, I said, no, we're not ready to give this up. And I decided that I was going to try to get the fairgrounds at Deerfield back where we started and bring it over there and do it. And that's what I did. I called a few friends, told them what I was going to do, and to make it short, we did it. We did it in 90 days, and we were able to open the gates on the 5th of May, 2007. It's a 2-day event. It starts Friday morning at 9 o'clock, and it goes till Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock. And then everybody gets booted out. We clean up the fairgrounds. We head home, and we wait for 6 months to do the next one. That is what Nearfest is. It's an old-fashioned, old-school type flea market, hamfest. We have commercial buildings. We got 3 of them. We have the flea market, probably the biggest one in the Northeast, and we have exams on Saturday, VE exams. Plus, we have very good food. That's another area where we have good food. We have one fellow who sells greasy fair food, which some people like. We have a lady who has Eastern European food, Polish and German cuisine. And we have the Deerfield Community Church ladies who do the best breakfast you're ever going to have. Pancakes with real maple syrup and blueberries, and just a delicious food experience. And we still do it twice a year.
And how many people do you get to Nearfest, would you say?
Last one, we didn't have too many. We were 1,400 in October because Thursday it started to rain around 2 in the afternoon. And it didn't stop raining until around 11 in the morning, Friday morning. So, yeah, our attendance was down. But the hardcore was there, and we had a successful Hamfest.
You said, I think earlier, that you do presentations. What kind of presentations do you do?
Well, they're called forums. We have a forum schedule. First of all, I want to make it very clear on one thing is Nearfest has not, nor will it ever be, an ARRL sanctioned event. We are an independent Hamfest. We can run it fine without interference from the league. And they do. They give you a whole list of things that you must do if you're going to be an ARRL sanctioned event. However, we have a new director in New England now. He's been in office for almost a year. Fred, AB1, what's his call? I should know it. Anyway, Fred. And Fred is the ARRL director. He does an ARRL forum at our Hamfest because we're not anti-league. We just don't need to be approved by them to do a Hamfest. But we are not anti. So we had an ARRL forum.
Tim
didn't do one this time. He does them. He does them at Boxborough, which is the ARRL New England Convention. He does them here, too. Now I'm embarrassed because I don't remember what the forums were.
You have a number of forums that people can go to.
We had 7. Mitch Stern at W1SJ is the forums chairman, and he does an absolutely phenomenal job at getting good forums. Tom Pereira does a forum. He did one at this one, too. He did one where he basically showed us how to disassemble the Enigma, the Fialka, and the M209 crypto machine. That one I did go and sit in on. Quite often I do the forum with Tom, but this time I was really busy because I've actually brought in a new person who is taking over as Director of Operations because I'm retiring from that role. I've done it for 16 years, and I want to retire. I still want to be involved with the Hamfest, and I will be, but I don't want to be involved with the day-to-day running of it. And Phil, K1 PXZ, and his wife, Kelly, KE1 LLY, LEY, are both going to be taking over a lot of the running of the fest on site. So I was working with him, to help him out to make sure that everything went smoothly, which it did. He's a former law enforcement officer, and those are the best guys you can get to run an event like this because nobody's going to screw around with them. Plus, I have to put in a word for our Sergeant-at-Arms, Paul W1PRA from Providence, Rhode Island. He's the Sergeant-at-Arms.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. I just wanted to kind of parenthetically add here, you've mentioned Tom Pierre a number of times. That's Tom Pierre W1TP. I interviewed Tom in episode 358 of the QSO Today podcast, and I'll put a link to that interview in the show notes page. I'm assuming that this is an ongoing enterprise now. 501c3 enterprise, so it will live beyond you and hopefully will be a source of used equipment and anything else that your wife doesn't want you to bring home?
Well, let's hope. Yes, we are a 501c3 nonprofit, tax-exempt entity. We have our determination from Uncle Sap that gives us that, and it's great because there's very little paperwork involved with the type of 501c3 that we are. And it's great because we don't accept donations, although people could donate, and we can give them receipts. But our revenue comes really from two places. It comes from the gate, when people pay to come in, and it comes from the commercial vendors who are renting table spaces. So we don't need money, actually. We get enough from those areas.
And that pays for the fairground and cleanup.
It pays for all the expenses that we incur. It's more than just the fairgrounds. We have to have chemical toilets. We have to have the ADA compliant toilets because the fair doesn't have them, and you got to have those. It goes to pay for the tables and chairs that we rent to the vendors. It goes to pay for the golf carts.
It's a big operation for every 6 months.
It goes to pay for the golf carts that we need to get around the ground because we're old guys and it's a big fairgrounds. So we need golf carts, and it's a big enterprise, but I should say that what we do with the money that's left over, our goals are to attract new people to the hobby with a special emphasis on young people. We fund a scholarship currently through the ARRL Foundation called the New England Amateur Radio Festival Memorial Scholarship in memory of those who were on the team who have become silent keys, and there are 7 of them, and we miss them every time. We also built an amateur station. Now, that was back in 2010, 2011 timeframe at the Christa McAuliffe Planetarium in Concord, New Hampshire. That was our first benevolent project, full amateur radio station capable of HF through VHF and satellite. It's still operational. KA1SKY is the call of that station. And what better place would there be to have a ham radio station operating than at a science center full of young people all the time? And that's what we do.
Do you have like a regular rotation of hams who operate the station?
We don't. The Kentucky Valley Radio Club, the CVRC, which is the amateur radio club that operates in the New Hampshire capital region, which is around Concord, has operators that go there to operate the station. I'm not sure of whether it's a regular schedule or not. Initially, when we did this, we were able to get 5 people on staff at the planetarium license. But people move on, and that didn't really work out to get the staff operating. They didn't have the time to operate. But the station is on the air, and I'm told that it's operating enough for us to consider it to stay there, because essentially our agreement is that we maintain ownership of the equipment. And if it's not being operated, we have the right to remove the equipment and put it somewhere else.
Well, that seems only fair.
We don't want to do that, obviously, but if it's going to sit there and not do anything, we can pull it out. But we have never even thought of doing that.
What's the current rig?
My current rig?
You mentioned, the KWM2 and stuff, but do you have other equipment that you operate, even more modern equipment?
Yes. I have an Elecraft K3 that one of my friends found on Craigslist, and it was cheap, but he didn't have enough dough to buy it, so he called me and he told me about it. I went over and grabbed it. The newest radio I have I actually have an IC705, but I also have one of your friend Wayne and Eric's 100-watt amplifiers, because to me, life's too short for QRP. That's the radio I like to operate remotely, which I'm having a lot of fun doing. And I can do it with an iPad. You can do it with a phone. I do it with an iPad.
So you're operating the IC705 remotely, using also the Elecraft KPA 100 amplifier?
Yes, the KPA 100 with the built-in tuner, because that's automatic. And I even have antenna switching that I can switch antennas online too. There's some guy in Bulgaria that makes that. There's also another one that's going to be going up on Timtron Mountain up in Maine. That's going to be a Kiwi SDR, which is an SDR that you can access through its website. You don't need any special software to go onto Kiwi SDR. It's KIWISDR.com. It's a very interesting setup, and the receiver and everything is all in a little package. It's got a little Raspberry Pi type. It's not a Raspberry Pi, but it's a Raspberry Pi type of little computer on it, and plug it into your router and plug in an antenna, and that will go on there. They only go up to 30 megahertz, so that's the shortcoming of that one. But it'll be good up on Timmy's mountain, because Timmy lives on a mountain in Skowhegan, Maine, right in the middle of the state of Maine. And that's an interesting part of the world to be able to sit and listen to the radio as well. All these SDR radios online are fascinating, too, that you can go over and listen. Some of these Kiwi SDRs were on in the Ukraine when that whole thing started.
Well, you're giving me some very interesting thoughts in terms of remotely controlling an IC705. I have the KPA 100 amplifier and tuner, but I don't have the IC705, but it's an interesting idea that I'd never thought to use that as a remote control radio, but it has a very fine receiver.
You wouldn't think it, would you? But
no, I wouldn't, but now I'm thinking it.
But it is. It's excellent. Excellent piece of equipment, because it covers. One of my favorite radios for mobile operation is the IC7000. I like ICOM radios, by the way, for, Asian radios. I like ICOM radios. In my opinion, the best HF radio they ever made was the IC735. It's 1985 to 2000, 15-year production run for the IC735. You can repair them. They're beautiful radio, general coverage receiver, the whole 9 yards. But the 705 essentially has the same interface as the 7300, which I really haven't had much experience with the 7300. But it has some of the features of the IC7000. The IC705, for example, you have a lot of choices when it comes to bandpass. You can go all the way up to 10 kilohertz of bandpass. Most amateur radios, if they have AM at all, do not go anywhere near that wide. But quite honestly, if you want to hear the full fidelity of some of these AM signals, not only on the amateur bands, the broadcast bands, wherever, 10 kilohertz is very nice to have. And especially if you're playing around with a remote radio, you want to have all the tools. It also goes up to the UHF region, and I can even get on the local UHF CB repeater here and go on and schmooze with the gangsters over there, all remote. I can do that on Echolink. I can do that in one of many different ways. But I'm not a big fan of Echolink, because I think too many people can get on there without having a license, and I'm not in favor of that.
Do you have like a native app for a smartphone or pad that works with that 705? Or using the ICOM software?
Yes, there's one that, in fact, no, I don't use the ICOM software. I use software written by a gentleman in Germany. Did a beautiful job with it. And here's a shameless plug. I wrote a review of it for QST. It's in the November issue for the IC705. So if you have the, unfortunately, my article was cut up, and the editor decided he'd write his own review instead of mine, but he put mine in as a sidebar. But I don't care. I mean, the thing got publicity, and I've just read now that he's added a way to the IC7300 can also be operated remotely. Now, this fellow writes software for Mac. He wrote the software for Mac for the Flex radios, and he wrote this piece of software for the IC705 for Mac and for iPad. It works very, very well. You put an external microphone on your iPad, and you can play radio anywhere. It's easy to set up, too. It's not a hair puller. I'm not a computer, tech guy. I can do stuff with computers, but it's challenging. It challenges my ability sometimes to figure them out.
We were talking before we started a little bit about how when you have the space for ham radio, then you end up buying equipment to fill the space. As I get older, I keep thinking that I want to kind of downsize. And so I'm looking at this idea of how do I downsize the entire station into an outdoor cabinet that I could put on the side of somebody else's building with the antennas on the top, maybe in a quieter area, so that in my retirement I can remotely control it without having all of the stuff. I mean, as a kid, I wanted all of the stuff. Maybe as a big kid, in my 60s, I still want all the stuff. On the other hand, I have an eye to the future, and you're giving me some amazing ideas in terms of how to maybe package a remote HF station into something that could be put someplace other than on a big house.
Well, it has to be somewhere where you can have the antennas.
Yeah, I'm thinking of an orchard. I'm surrounded by, kibbutzim that have orchards on top of hills. So it seems like, wouldn't it be nice to have like a solar-powered radio in an orchard on top of a hill where there's no electronic noise?
It would be very nice, and you can do it. As I say, the one thing you can't downsize, really, are the antennas, although if you start playing around with magnetic loop antennas and stuff, it's amazing what you can do with them, too.
That's right, yes.
In fact, Ted, K1QAR, who I mentioned earlier, of the Desert Storm R390 fame, is very heavily into experimentation with magnetic loop antennas. And he sets one up. Well, he can tell you about Nearfest, too. Ted is a piece of work. I get a real kick out of Ted. He's a lot of fun. He wears his lab coat with his company, Aesop Engineering. He'll be interesting. You'll get a kick out of him.
I had a great time with him, and I learned a lot of stuff that I probably wouldn't have thought to ask, but it came out in the conversation. And the listeners, I'll point that back to, I think, episode 428. We record all of these episodes well in advance. I'm trying to anyway, so that I'm not under pressure to produce one the same week that they're due. But that was a great conversation. And you know what? What I liked about Ted's, and everyone else can hear the conversation with Ted, he's pretty much mastered magnetic loop antennas, and they're not as difficult as one would think they are to build.
No, they're not. And they look like they're assembled from junk, which is on purpose.
What's interesting, he'll suspend them from trees. It doesn't have to sit on a beautiful pedestal with a rotator. If you have a tree, because you have an HOA, you can actually hang that loop in the tree.
Mm-hmm. He does. He sets up at Nearfest with one on a tripod. He sets up at the ARRL New England Convention with it usually just hanging out the door. And they work phenomenally well. He used to have a workshop at Minuteman Airport in in Massachusetts. I'm trying to think what the name of the town is. It doesn't matter. It's out in western Mass, out near 495. Interstate 495, which is the outer ring highway around Boston. And it was a small airport. It's just a general aviation airport. And we go out there and hang out with Ted for hours, and just sitting around. And I don't think he was really doing business there. I think he'd, sell a few R390As to pay some of his expenses. But it was a place for him to go to, like going to the office, because basically Ted's retired. Now Ted moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is down on the south coast. So he gave up his space at the airport, and that's where he's on. I haven't been down there. It's kind of out of the way down there. I go down there periodically, visit a friend of mine who's one of my police badge collecting buddies, but that's another story. He's a piece of work too, but I don't go down there often.
I know that you're a collector of spy radios. And could you talk a little bit about spy radios? What are spy radios? And were we talking about spy radios when we were talking about the R390, or are we talking about something else?
No, the R390, 390A, we talked about the R325, and I said it was a spook radio, but it's not really a spy radio by definition. A spy radio is a radio that's compact and easy to set up and operate, so it can be done covertly and quickly, so you don't get caught. Because if you get caught operating one of those, that's likely to be the last thing you're ever going to do. See, it's dangerous.
So in the context, we're talking about spy radios were first introduced during, World War II?
Well, they had radios in World War I that were capable of that type of operation, but they weren't used as much. World War II in Europe, mostly, although after, in Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, but the birth of the spy radio, I would say, was in World War II, in any great numbers. And sets that you can find. Most of them were developed at super secret labs, mostly by radio amateurs.
Really?
When you think about it, yes. They were the guys who were capable of doing this kind of stuff. And there are British spy radios, and there are American, U.S. spy radios, and German spy radios, and all kinds of spy radios. They're hard to find if people know what they are. They're expensive. But the main thing is they have to be small and easily transportable. One of them was made to be transported inside a loaf of bread. One of them was made to look like a typewriter case. That's the PRC-5.
What do you own that you might have a picture of that you can send to me so we can put that in the show notes?
Well, the one I would send you would be my PRC. That's a World War II vintage. It looks like a typewriter. Tom has one, too.
It's a PRC what?
A 5.
PRC-5.
The PRC-1, PRC-5, the GRC 109, RS-1, RS-6, RS Radio Station 6, Radio Station 1. Those are all from one of the three-letter agencies. Those are post-war. British. I don't have a British suitcase. George, K1ANX, does. He also has a nice spy radio collection. He also has enemy radios, which are, by definition, radios that were used by the enemy. And he has German radios and Japanese radios from the war. I don't have any enemy radios. Actually, I lie. I do have a receiver that's Japanese, but I'm not sure exactly what it is even. It's one of those things that I have never seen documented anywhere, and I don't know what it is.
The ones that you have, are they operational?
Oh, yes, absolutely. What's the fun of having a radio if you can't operate it?
Well, some people might want to just, say I've got it rather than get it operational.
They're easy they're simple. They're mostly CW radio, because CW is the simplest form of radio there is, because you just have your carrier, you switch it on and off. You've got a radio transmitter. The PRC-64, or the Delco 5300, that's the agency name for that radio, was the Delco 5300, but the military name in the Vietnam area was the PRC-64. That has AM as well, has a key built right into it. You don't need anything. You flip it open, and even the switch is in the lid, and as soon as you open the lid, the radio's switched on, crystal controlled, 2 to 8 megahertz, so you can get on 80 and 40 with it. And it even had a Collins mechanical filter in it, 500 cycle Collins filter in it. That's 60s vintage. Nice radio.
If somebody wanted to start collecting spy radios, what kind of budget should they have to put together a fairly decent collection of, say, 5 radios?
You'd have to have pretty deep pockets for 5 of them. The ones that I have, I never paid a lot of money for them, but I bought them at flea markets over the years. The guys that had them weren't sure what they were. But to go on eBay, say, today and do it, a couple $grand each, even more. The PRC-5s are complete and everything are worth about $25, $3. GRC 109, which is the military name for the RS-1, was used by the Army also. That was a station that could be buried in the ground and left behind. You get one of those with the 3 parts, it's 3 boxes, for about $1,000. Fair Radio Sales had them back in the 90s, and you could get the whole station for $100 if you knew what it was. But when they ran out, and I used to buy them, and I tell my buddies, listen, buy one of these. This is a neat set. It's the military version of the RS-1. It's got military nomenclature, but it's a spy radio. It's the same radio as the CIA used to use, called the RS-1. You get the receiver for $50, a power supply for $25, transmitter for $25, $100. You got yourself a spy set. None of them did it. And then one said, hey, can I get one of those radios from Fair? I said, well, guess what? You can't get the receivers. They're sold out.
So the pricing is supply and demand, pure market forces, right? As the demand increases, could be another asset like owning fine art.
It could be, I suppose, but I don't think the demand is as great. As I say now, a GRC 109 that you could get in the 90s for $100 from fair radio sales. I've seen them at flea markets for $600-700, the 3 boxes. But then there was a hand crank generator set. Now those are very rare. I have one, but and it was hard even for me to get that.
Do you think, Mike, that flea markets is an old man's hobby?
No.
I mean, do you think that what you're seeing at your event, that it now attracts younger people as well?
Yeah, sure it does. I mean, we admit young people at no cost. Students, full-time students of any age, anyone who looks young, come on in. We encourage it. We have a relationship with the people that do the MIT flea market in Cambridge. They're welcome at our event, and they come, and they have a ball. They've never seen anything like it.
What kind of stuff do they take home from the flea market?
I have no idea. I wasn't really paying attention to that part of it. But they take home whatever strikes their fancy. You know, the flea market is cheap thrills.
It was always for me.
To go to a flea market, you probably used to go to TRW.
I'd been to TRW a couple of times, but in those days I kind of, I was into phones, and so I was, looking for AT&T, Bell system gear, and they had that at TRW.
Okay. Oh, yeah. They used to have all kinds of stuff at TRW. And we go down at Santee. There was a flea down at Santee. There was, you could go every weekend. I used to go when I was out there. I used to go with my buddy Neil, K6SMF, to flea markets all over the place. He used to go every weekend. He'd jump in the station wagon, and off we'd go to a flea somewhere. And go to Santee. We go to TRW once a month. Although I hear TRW is not the... I hear that it's gone the way now of you can go and buy underwear and...
It's a swap meet. I got into amateur radio in the 70s, and in Southern California, there was a group of guys led by Leroy Sparks, W6SYC. May his memory be for a blessing. Anyway, Leroy would go into the San Fernando Valley. In the 70s, there were still the big surplus, electronic surplus places that had a lot of military hardware. And you could go, every Saturday and come back with a station wagon full of stuff. There was a lot of stuff, at least on the West Coast. It sounds to me like on the East Coast, too. There was just a lot of stuff. There was.
There was a place in Lynn, Massachusetts, called Meshna, John Meshna. He always had tons and tons of stuff. I drive by there occasionally when I'm going places, and the memories are there. So I know what you're talking about. And in that day you could buy stuff like an R13 with all the little bits and pieces, or a TCS, which I love the TCS station. TCS, beautiful station. Navy radio, 25 watts, made by Collins and other, but the TCS 12, I have one out in the garage, made by Collins Radio. You could get that stuff for like $100 in the box, in the crate.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. Nuts and Bolts Magazine is a new sponsor and is an amazing resource for new and old hams alike. Click on the banner to get your online or paper subscription of Nuts and Bolts. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. Now, you also collect police badges. You mentioned that a little bit earlier.
I do.
So tell me a little bit about that. I mean, how big is your collection, and is there an organization, or is there a group that collects this stuff? I guess you can collect anything.
You can collect anything. Well, I got into that when I was working for the paper, and I dealt a lot with the police. And I met this guy who was a collector, and I was fascinated by the whole idea because cops, their badges are like a holy grail. And getting a cop's badge is like, that's good. Can't be anything tougher than that. It's a challenge to a collector, because collecting is basically negotiation and deal-making, and this was going to be interesting. And I managed to score a Montreal police badge, which, was fascinated me. And my buddy was very good at getting stuff. And he worked for the railroad cop. And he had a huge collection, unbelievable stuff from all over the world. And I just got interested in it. In the early 80s, they started having collector shows down here and up there in Canada. And I came down to a collector show in New York. And I met the guy who ran the show. And he was so amused and impressed that I came all the way down from Montreal to go to his show. He started we started trading. He wanted stuff from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which, I could get. And I got him some stuff. And he got me stuff from New York City that was just unbelievable. Unbelievable. So how big is my collection? I have no idea how many I have. Unlike most of the people in this country who collect, I collect internationally. I collect from all over the world. And I've got some stuff in my collection that is like really, really neat stuff. It's museum stuff. I have 3 badges from the Préfecture de Police de Paris from 1940 to 1944, which was during the German occupation.
Oh, interesting.
And that stuff, the German police, their detectives or their plainclothesmen, used to have their badge was a disc on the end of a chain. And they'd pull it out of their pocket and they'd wave it on the chain at you and show you their badge. Well, they made the French police have one of those too, and I got one of those things, and there's about 6 guys in France that would do anything to get their hands on that badge. They'd never even seen one.
Do you display these, or do you have them like squirreled away in a cabinet so it's something that you have that you could pull out and show somebody, but it's not on display like in a display case?
I have a couple of frames on the wall in my radio room, actually, that have some of my better badges, my favorite badges. Most of them are squirreled away, and I have patches, too. And I even have license plates. I have some state police license plates. Not many, because I don't really collect them, but I've come across them, and I have a mini collection of state police license plates, which are also very hard to get, as you can imagine. One of my buddies that I met at some of these shows, he was the fleet manager for one of the state police agencies in this area, and he worked in the garage. He was the fleet manager. So every once in a while, a plate would fall into his hands. And he's got the biggest collection of license plates, state police, highway patrol, probably there is. Him and a fellow in Ontario. I've seen their collections, and they're huge. But I've got a couple that landed on my table, shall we say. They're kind of neat stuff. It's neat stuff. And people look at it and say...
When I'm thinking about it, it seems to me that even a police department like New York City, for example, must have a whole bunch of different kinds of badges, right? Because there's different kinds of policemen, there's different kinds of boroughs, right? The shape or the color or even the insignias on the badges could change?
Well, New York City is an interesting one to talk about because New York City had 3 separate police departments. They had the city police, they had the transit police, and they had the housing police. They all have different ranks. Now, they're a very traditional department. They don't change their badges very often. The shield that the now called police officer, but used to be patrolman, wear has been in use since 1902. So they don't change them. Now, they don't change them very quickly. And they're all different shapes. The patrolman shield looks like one thing. Sergeant shield looks like another shape. The lieutenant's badge is another shape, all the way up. And they've got all these different ranks. To make this more complicated, New York City controls the badges very tightly, as do most departments. So there are people who make what they call dupes, which are basically copies for the guys that have more than one badge, because you need one in your wallet, you need one on your shirt, you need one on your coat. They make dupes. It's difficult to tell the difference between a dupe and a department-issued badge. And there's also fakes. There's people out there making fake badges. So you have to be very careful. Other cities are very tight. Los Angeles, for example, LAPD has been wearing that same familiar oval shield with the City Hall on it since 1939. That's the most desired police badge there is. Every collector wants an LAPD. It's called a Series 6. Why? It's the 6th badge that they've worn since 1939. Why does everybody want it? Dragnet, Adam 12, all these TV shows, which those 2 shows, incidentally, were the only shows where they actually used real LAPD badges. Jack Webb, who created Dragnet, had an excellent relationship with Chief Parker of the LAPD, and they authorized him as the only civilian who was ever allowed to carry an LAPD badge in his pocket. When he passed away, the badge went to the museum where it is today. Adam 12 was a show that was done by his production company. Every day they were shooting, a police car would come to the set with 2 badges and 2 hats for Reed and Malloy, and they wore authentic badges, and then at the end of the day, they were there to pick them up and take them. They would not even let them keep them overnight.
Oh, what a great story. Because I watched all those shows growing up. Yeah, that was really cool.
Sure we did. And everybody wants one of those shields, that oval shield. It's funny, California, Southern California, they like ovals. Northern California, they like 7-pointed stars.
Like the new sheriff in town.
Well, the 7-point star doesn't look like a sheriff's badge. San Francisco police have a 7-pointed sterling silver badge. It's a beautiful badge, very plain. Just silver, says San Francisco police and a number on it. And that's the only badge they get from the department. And then when they get promoted, they get their own badge made up, which they can make up out of gold and all kinds of precious metal. But the only badge they ever get from the department is that sterling silver badge, which they have to turn it back in when they leave. LAPD, now they let them buy it and put a retired panel on it. They didn't used to do that. You had to turn it in. And an LAPD badge is extremely difficult to get. There are many copies of it. They're very hard to tell because over that period of time, they've had several different companies had official contracts to make them. The ones that you see in collections, they say policeman. The title now is police officer. That started in 1972. So they have all these policeman badges that were not current badges, and therefore they wouldn't get too excited if they found out you had it. But if they find out that you have a current LAPD badge, they'll come and try to get it back.
That's fascinating. And again, it's like anything else. You don't really think about other collections. But collections have histories and stories and research and all that other stuff. So thanks for sharing that with me, because I think that's really a great story.
Oh, you're very welcome. I mean, people collect all kinds of stuff. I have a friend who collects air sickness bags from different airlines.
I did, too, when I was in school. He had everybody's air sickness bag, and apparently he would, even airlines he didn't travel on, he would write to them, and they would send him an air sickness bag.
They will, and you used to be able to write to police departments and ask for a shoulder patch, and they would send you one, but now they won't because the cost of those is too much, and they get too many requests. But some of them, one of the most popular states to collect, by the way, is California. Some of those patches that were worn in California in the 60s and so forth, they're worth hundreds and hundreds of dollars. Go on eBay. They're there, and they're big money.
Well, I'm looking for a Motrack control head and speaker to kind of put in my car. I was actually going to create an all-star node in it so that I could actually use it. And you go on eBay, this is stuff that's 60, 70 years old. It's hundreds of dollars. A Motrack speaker can be $150, $200.
Come to Nearfest, you'll find one for about $10.
I'll do that. I'll spend $1,200 to fly to Nearfest and get one.
Well, why don't you do that?
I may do that at some point. It's a great idea.
Neil, K6SMF, used to drive cross-country to come to Nearfest. He's been at many of them. He stopped coming now because he's 83 years old. But he used to drive cross-country to come to my Hamfest.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
Getting new people into the hobby, especially young people, keeping our frequencies.
If you were the guy who was advising the heads of the amateur radio hobby on how we would do that, do you have any thoughts on how we might get new people, especially younger people, into the hobby?
It's tough. It's very tough because there are so many things that are competing for their free time and so many easier things. If they want to play ham radio, they can play ham radio on the Internet. They don't need to get a license. They don't need to study. They don't need to do anything. They don't need to put up an antenna. The only argument that we have to convince young people the difference between amateur radio and using infrastructure-based means of communication, which the Internet is one, is that if something goes down, you're out of luck. You can't communicate. The server goes down. This goes down. That goes down. With real amateur radio, doesn't matter if it goes down, because as long as you have a radio and a power source, whether it be a battery or a generator, and I have a radio and a power source, I can talk to you, and they can't stop you. They can try to jam you, but they can't really stop you. Maybe that's the only argument that we have as to the advantage of doing all that work and studying and taking tests and fighting with neighbors and municipalities to put up antennas and spending the money it takes to do it. It's the only argument I see.
Well, I think that's interesting. I've got 15 boys in a Boy Scout Radio Merit Badge group here that's starting here this next week. So we'll see whether or not we can interest any of those kids in ham radio, once they get through the merit badge. I'll have a personal experience in terms of seeing what their objections are, what their interest is. They seem to be kind of excited when I presented it a week or two ago. So what advice would you give to newer returning hams?
Don't try to do it all in one day. Go back, if you're returning, do something familiar at first and get the feel for the changes that have taken place in the hobby that have taken place since you left. I just made contact with somebody who has been inactive for many years through another thing. In fact, I was looking for parts for my Prius, and somebody tried to scam me, and they used his name. And I called him to see if he had sent me this message, and he said no, he hadn't, and he mentioned he'd been inactive for many years. He's going to go on my friend Joe W3GMS's repeater in Pennsylvania, where he has kind of like a new hams and returning hams repeater that he owns. It's on Echolink and on the other one.
All-Star IRLP?
All-Star. It's an All-Star node. W3GMS is his repeater. But, it's not the same hobby as it was when you left. So, learn about all the different things you can do, and don't try to do it all in one day. Ease back into it. As far as new hams is concerned, my advice to new hams is do not get involved in 2-meter 450 repeaters at first. Get on HF.
Yeah, but how do you do that with a technician class license? That's CW only, right?
It would be. You could. I sort of forgot about that. But to me, 2-meter repeaters and VHF, UHF repeaters isn't really ham radio anymore. And not here, certainly in the Boston area. It's very depressing to listen. It's not that they're bad operators, but they're talking about politics, which is not good.
Not on ham radio, no.
Stay away from the politics. This country has been so successfully split up by the politicians and so polarized now. And that's exactly what they want. They want to divide us up, and they've done it. Don't fall into that trap. Stay away from that subject. Religion, politics, sex. Do not get into those areas. It won't serve any useful purpose at all.
Well, Mike, I think that's sage advice to give to new and returning hams. So with that, I want to wish you 73, and thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. By the way, you never did get my title at Nearfest. I think you should know what my title is.
What is your title at Nearfest?
I'm the benevolent dictator.
I think that says that on your QRZ page, that you're the benevolent dictator. I'll make sure that everyone knows that you're the benevolent dictator at Nearfest.
And it's poly added for life. Eric, it's been a real pleasure.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Mike. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W1RC in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of this fine sponsor by clicking on their link in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, click on the transcribe button at the top of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. By using the Amazon link on the home page before you shop at Amazon allows Amazon to send us a small commission on what you purchase that further keeps our QSO Today project going. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as we work towards episode 500. QSO Today is now available on a large number of podcast players and now a host of podcast services and applications. We are Podcast 2.0 compatible. I now use the Fountain podcast player to listen to all of my favorite podcasts. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.